But I think we should just get started. My name is Evan Wood. I'm a professor of medicine at UBC. I'm one of the founders of Stop the Violence BC. And essentially I've been tasked with giving a little bit of background about the Stop the Violence BC Coalition for about 2 minutes, and then I'll set a bit of an agenda for this morning. So I think, as everybody knows, British Columbia has been dealing with major issues related to organized crime and gang violence as a result of the marijuana industry. And although police have been acknowledging this, your average British Columbian, and Canadian for that matter, doesn't really know that all the grow ops and all the organized crime concerns are really a direct result of marijuana prohibition. So that's where Stop the Violence BC comes in. We are a coalition of experts that is engaging in a public education campaign with 3 key issues that we're trying to bring forward. The first is that marijuana prohibition has not achieved its stated objectives. For people that doubt that, you can look at the government's own data, which shows that young people have easier access to marijuana than alcohol and tobacco. If you still don't believe that, I encourage you on Friday to go to the art gallery for the annual 420 event, where I think this reality should be clear to everybody. We're also talking about the unintended consequences of prohibition. Obviously, I've alluded to some of those. All of the harms related to the marijuana industry are an expected and natural consequence of our current laws and policies. And the last thing that we're talking about is the value of a regulated and taxed market for adult marijuana use. And with any coalition, it's an interesting group that's come together. Just a week or 2 ago, it was the Chief Medical Health Officer, Perry Kendall, who came out in support of taxation and regulation of marijuana. He was simply joining the vast number of individuals from public health and medicine who have said exactly the same thing, including the Health Officers Council of British Columbia. We, of course, have been joined by individuals from law enforcement, and today we have someone who will be speaking to us who is operating at the very highest level of drug law enforcement in the United States. And of course, on this side of the border, we have former prosecutors, former Supreme Court justices, former and current members of law enforcement who have all been saying exactly the same thing. And of course, when you have a broad coalition like this, it obviously creates interesting bedfellows. And of course, we're being joined by individuals from the community who for many years have been saying exactly the same thing. So with that background in mind, I'll just set the agenda for how things are going to go this morning. First, I'll be leaving the podium for Geoff Plant. I think everybody in the room knows that Geoff Plant was MLA for the better part of 10 years in this province. From 2001 to 2005, he was Attorney General in this province. He's one of the 4 famous Attorney Generals who came out in support of Stop the Violence BC. Geoff will introduce John. John will speak for approximately 20 minutes. And then at that time, we're going to ask members of the public that have assembled to please leave the room so we can start with the press conference. The press conference will be approximately 10 to 15 minutes with Geoff, John, and myself. And then Jodie Emery will come and join us for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. So with that, I think I'll turn things over to Geoff.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks to everyone for being here this morning. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be on this platform today. As someone who was the Chief Law Officer of the Government of British Columbia, I know that when we think of using law enforcement as a tool, we usually think that it's going to make a problem go away. When we're talking about cannabis, the effect of law enforcement is to make the problem worse in almost every respect. And for the last few weeks, since I was privileged to join with 3 other former Attorneys General in a call for taxation and regulation, I've had lots of conversations with people and really lots and lots of support. One question that gets asked from time to time is, what could we do in Canada given what is happening south of the border in the United States? And I think that there is an impression that Canadians often have that we would be at risk if we attempted to make our law more progressive vis-a-vis what's happening south of the border. That's particularly why I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to hear from a law enforcement official from the United States who's going to tell us that that's not necessarily so, and who's going to make the strong case why we all have to join together to change a failed public policy approach and move towards the regulation and taxation approach. John McKay is a former United States Attorney for the District of Western Washington. We actually met, I'm sure, about a decade ago in the aftermath of 9/11 when the governments on both sides of the border were working hard to deal with cross-border terrorism risks. And indeed now, these days, he's a professor of constitutional law in terrorism at the Seattle University School of Law. He has a long history of public service, working as a White House fellow, working as a special assistant to the director of the FBI, a very distinguished career as a United States Attorney. In 1995, he was named the Pro Bono Lawyer of the Year by the Washington State Bar Association. He received the association's Award of Merit, which is the highest honor that association can give, and in 2007 received the Courageous Award. So he is much honored and I think very articulate and enormously persuasive official on this important issue, which he has now joined his voice to, particularly in relation to initiatives in Washington State. So I'm just delighted to now welcome John McKay to the podium.
Geoff, thank you very much. I appreciate that very kind introduction. I am John McKay. I'm currently a law professor in Seattle at Seattle University, but I spent more than 5 years as the United States Attorney in Seattle. In our system in the United States Attorney serves as the chief federal law enforcement official for their district. Among those duties, as Geoff pointed out, were counterterrorism, counterintelligence, international and interstate crime, and key to that, international cross-border drug crime, to include marijuana prosecutions. And so I'm very pleased to be here today to discuss my support as a private citizen now for the regulation and taxation of marijuana as a much better answer to the enormous threat facing citizens of both Canada and the United States because of our failed policies on marijuana. And I want to say this just as clearly and as forthrightly as I can. Marijuana prohibition, criminal prohibition of marijuana, is a complete failure. It's a failure in the United States. I would respectfully offer that it is a failure here in Canada as well, and that the problem posed by the vast marijuana black market, criminal marijuana black market, is a threat to public safety both in the United States and in Canada. I think it's time to rethink our criminalization policy and prohibition policy on marijuana. We know this through scores and scores of prosecutions. We know this through many individuals who have been incarcerated and placed in jail. We know this because there are millions of Canadians and millions of Americans who regularly smoke marijuana in the face of criminal penalties. So we know absolutely and completely that marijuana prohibition is a failure. And it's time for our legislators on both sides of the border, in the United States Congress, in the parliaments in Canada, nationally and provincially, in the legislatures, including in my home state, the state of Washington, to rethink these failed policies. I currently sponsor an initiative, along with others, in the state of Washington called Initiative 502. This would be a change in the state's policy on marijuana. Both the state and federal government currently make the possession of any amount of marijuana illegal, with the exception under state law in Washington for medical use of marijuana, and I'll come back to medical use in just a moment. But it's clear that any citizen in the United States, whether possessing a prescription of some kind for marijuana or not, is susceptible to being arrested by federal authorities, those of whom I oversaw in my duties as United States Attorney. So we have the untenable situation in the state of Washington, just south of here, where it is simultaneously legal and illegal to possess or use marijuana for certain persons. And I would suggest this is a failure, a further evidence of failure of our policies. Government's a failure when it simultaneously is telling its citizens something is legal and illegal. And it certainly is a call that our policymaking bodies reform their own approach to marijuana. I'm going to come back to what I see as the threat. I want to just sketch out quickly what I-502 does just south of the border. I think it's very innovative. We will see it on our ballot. 502 would regulate and tax marijuana. It would make it legal to possess for adults an ounce or less of marijuana at any particular time. It would be regulated at every point of its production, its sale, its taxation, its content, and then the use of the proceeds. And the proceeds, which I think will be very significant, our estimates range as high as $500 million would be raised in tax revenues in a fully taxable year under 502. And those proceeds would be earmarked under our initiative that has been submitted to the people for use in public health models rather than law enforcement models. This would include education. It would include treatment. It would continue to make sure that we make it illegal to sell and distribute to juveniles, to minors. It would continue to be illegal to drive while intoxicated by marijuana. It would be illegal to pilot boats or to use heavy machinery while using marijuana. Excuse me. So all of these things continue under the current regime. Why does the policy need to change? The policy needs to change because we have failed, as I've indicated, and we are, through our policies, promoting a huge black market with billions of dollars that are being exploited by criminal cartels, by gangs, organized crime on both sides of the border. I want to give you just a few examples of cases that were prosecuted. And then I want to talk for a moment about the case of Marc Emery, whose arrest I authorized, whose prosecution I helped commence before a federal grand jury in Seattle. And as many of you know, he continues to serve time in a federal prison in the United States. If you were to look at the leading criminal prosecutions federally, which is I would suggest our highest level of prosecution in the United States, and you just perused the list of individuals who have been arrested, you will see Canadian after Canadian after Canadian arrested in the United States, prosecuted in the United States, incarcerated in the United States. And I want to give you a couple of examples. The most recent posting you will find, if you look at the United States Attorney's Office press room, is March 30th, 2012, and it's a Canadian who helped coordinate an elaborate cocaine trafficking and transportation scheme involving the Sinaloa cartel, one of the largest and most dangerous Mexican drug cartels. And this individual was arrested and convicted for smuggling cocaine north to Canada, and in exchange for marijuana coming south from British Columbia. So under the economic scheme which is developed under this illegal marijuana market, we see vast marijuana production here in lower British Columbia. We see it transported illegally across the border despite enormous U.S. resources which are attempting to prevent just that thing from occurring. Billions of dollars worth of marijuana going essentially right down the I-5 corridor, but that's being exchanged for something. It's not just money, it's guns and it's cocaine and other drugs going back and forth across the border, but that's the basic exchange. And so you saw in this particular prosecution of Mr. Mario Joseph Fenianos, a Canadian who lived in Los Angeles. He was responsible for receiving the cocaine, which was going to make its way back up north here to Canada in exchange for BC Bud marijuana in California. Not many people know of or think about this connection between the growth of massive amounts of marijuana grown here in British Columbia and direct exchange with violent, despicable drug cartels in Mexico. And the link is very, very clear to us who are in law enforcement. Cocaine and methamphetamine production, principally occurring or originating in Mexico, distributes the marijuana that is shipped to Southern California. The cocaine then comes back up. In February also of this year, a Mr. Yim, a Canadian citizen, also was arrested and then convicted for shipping 19 kilos of cocaine from Southern California to Canada, again, in exchange for agreements to distribute BC bud marijuana in Southern California. And Southern California is a distribution point. It's also a point of great consumption for BC bud, which is obviously grown here. March 25th, I wanted to highlight this case, March 25th of 2011, so just a year ago, 7 Canadian members of the Hells Angels. So the Hells Angels is no secret, massively involved here in the collection of the marijuana that's grown here and its distribution south across the border. They, along with Asian gangs here, are typically responsible for the harvesting, the collection, the distribution, and of course the payment to those who would engage in the manufacture or growing of marijuana here. 7 arrested and convicted in the United States, all residents of British Columbia. Some were dual citizens. They were sentenced to 20 years in prison because of the amounts of marijuana involved. Many times the marijuana will go south and the deal for cocaine is done through another connection such as the one that I just mentioned to you a moment ago. February 15th, 2011, Clay Franklin Roche of Vancouver, sentenced in U.S. District Court to 30 years in prison. Conspiracy to export cocaine coming this way, to import marijuana coming this way. So you see in Mr. Roche, and I've got more of these. I won't bore you by reading all of the details, but if you just take the press releases being issued by the United States Attorney's Office, through whom the Drug Enforcement Administration and the FBI coordinate all of their activities, the principal face you will see of it is the arrest of individuals either working with or for Canadian gangs and illegal marijuana manufacturers and distributors, or connecting to Mexican drug cartels in Southern California. This is an enormously potent and dangerous environment, which it is only fair to say is created and maintained by our failed criminal marijuana prohibition. Law enforcement, through tremendous effort, highly skilled, well-trained, well-financed, knows that they are only getting the smallest percentage of the commodity, the fewer numbers of individuals who are actually involved in this activity, and a teeny amount of the very dangerous Canadian and U.S. dollars that are associated with this campaign. And what happens to those dollars? I would suggest to you that the fact that Mexican drug cartels, dangerous gangs operating both in the United States and in Canada, are all profiting from the black market that is created by our failed policy. So if you strategically look at the question of what do we do about the violence that's being spawned here, the pits that are uncovered with headless bodies thrown in, it's because they are servicing the demand for drugs, beginning with marijuana, moving all the way through to cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin, driven principally, I believe, by the huge dollars that are tied to marijuana, not to the cocaine, to the meth and the heroin, but to the marijuana. The United States analysts have indicated that as much as 60% of the income of Mexican drug cartels, for example, comes from the presence and existence of the American marijuana demand. Huge demand for marijuana. So I don't think it's important for us to cast blame on who would be responsible, whether it would be the production of marijuana in lower British Columbia or the demand for marijuana in Southern California, to use 2 examples. The fact is that prohibition, criminal prohibition, going back 75 years, has never been successful in stopping the demand for marijuana. And so individuals have made their choices. The individual consumer, if you will, has determined that they will smoke and use marijuana. That has not changed, despite the fact that we threaten to incarcerate people. 10,000 people per year are arrested and jailed in the state of Washington alone, and nearly 1 million across the United States for simple marijuana possession. that alone should provoke a lot of discussion and debate as to whether that is the way that we would want to deal with the health issues involved in consuming marijuana. I'm a law enforcement person. I'm not a health person like Dr. Wood is here, but I certainly question whether the threat posed by marijuana as a health concern merits a criminal penalty for its use. It seems much more likely and much more beneficial to treat it as a health issue, to let families deal with it, and to take law enforcement and apply it against those who are using the guns, who are using the violence, who are using it to create dangerous narcotics, and to pursue them and force them out of the market. And what will replace them? Legal enterprises licensed by the state if I-502 were to pass in the state of Washington, and a similar scheme, I think, which could be advanced here as Geoff Plant has suggested might be the future here, regulation and taxation. I have just a few more comments, and I want to just address a question first to discuss. I think I will address the Marc Emery situation. Let me just tell you that I have met Jodie Emery. She, I know, is going to join us in a few moments. She's a lovely person. I have to say that I have no regrets in terms of my prosecution of Marc Emery. Mr. Emery chose to change his policies, marijuana policies here, by breaking them rather than advocating for change. I think that was a tremendous mistake. His decision and choice was to sell marijuana seeds, which we considered to be marijuana, in the United States to any individual who wanted to purchase them. So we're in disagreement on what was the correct thing to do if that was Mr. Emery's purpose to change policy. I think he chose the wrong path. We do share, I think, a belief that the underlying policies are wrong, and the choices in how we address them are individual choices. Mine is to, now that I'm free to advocate for changes in policy, I'm no longer responsible for implementing them. As a person responsible for implementing the law, it's my sworn duty to do just that. But when not in that position, and as a person who is knowledgeable of the facts underlying our failure in marijuana prohibition, I am free now to speak out against it. And I know few have done so. I think it takes courage for someone like Geoff to step forward and to say our policies should be changed. And I'm hoping that more will step forward and do that. I know there is some concern that perhaps Canada might be moving too quickly, that maybe if Canada were to, or British Columbia were to look at regulation and taxation, that would somehow merit a negative response from the United States. I don't think that is at all the case. In fact, I think given what's happening in the state of Washington, a similar movement in the state of Colorado to regulate, tax, and legalize marijuana for adults in possession of small amounts, decriminalization in 14 states in the United States, medical marijuana in 16 states in the District of Columbia. I hardly think that a rethinking of marijuana laws on the south of the border, on the United States side of the border, will somehow discourage or should discourage policymakers here from considering that. There's been talk that somehow there would be retaliation by the United States if there were a regulation and taxation scheme here. Hardly. The same debate, perhaps further along, is occurring south of the border. So I look forward to questions here from the media, but I wanted to just finish by saying, you know, I do think, I don't want to sort of try to stand up here and assume any sort of moral high ground, but I think it's really important that when societies choose to criminalize behavior, we have broad agreement and support in the community that that behavior is criminal. We don't have that anymore in the state of Washington. I don't think we have it in the United States. I don't think there is broad agreement that persons with guns and badges, judges with authority, jailers with jails, and prisons should be utilized for this behavior. I don't think we have broad community agreement on that anymore. And I think every criminal law that we have where someone's liberty is at stake, that should be a prerequisite. I'm not suggesting that we poll on our criminal laws, but I think that we as a community, in the broadest, deepest sense of what a community is, should say that we have community agreement on this. And I would suggest to you that there is no one who could stand in front of you and say that communities broadly continue to support the criminalization of this activity. And so my simple question to policymakers on both sides of the borders is, why haven't you rethought this? So I think it's time to ask that question and to politely, respectfully, but firmly advance it as people who care about public safety, who care about dramatic and horrible gun violence, who care about what billions of dollars of proceeds handed over to criminals can and is doing, and it is time for change. And I want to state my deepest admiration for Dr. Evan Wood, for Stop the Violence BC, for the dialogue that they are encouraging. I'm proud to be associated with it. I really believe that this is a regional problem. It must have regional solutions. It requires cooperation, and that's why I'm here to help with this. And I will certainly appreciate and welcome and respect the same opinions and advice coming from our Canadian sisters and brothers who are willing to engage in this issue. Thank you very much for having me here today.